I work in the education department at Goldsmiths, but for many years I was an early years and primary teacher in Lambeth, and I've had 3 children go through Lambeth schools and come out the other end very successfully. I'm also a member of the UCU and joint rep for my department. So I'm actually not going to talk about vision. I'm going to talk more about Gove's policies, and as you can imagine, I've had to do a lot of scribbling out because a lot has been said already. One of the things I want to sort of come back to is the evidence or lack of evidence or contradiction of evidence in terms of what he's trying to do. But I will start with initial teacher education, because there's a crisis going on in initial teacher education. I'm not sure whether you're aware of that or not. The first thing is, of course, because of fees and the effect that that's going to have on the workforce in terms of teaching eventually. Because, of course, £9,000 fees, tripling of fees, means that the people who we want to come through and become teachers, many of them are not going to feel able to do that because they don't want to take on those sorts of debts. Perhaps, with the EMA going, people who may be the first in their families to go to university have decided, because the figures show it, that actually they don't want to get a degree. And if they don't get that degree, then it's very difficult for them to become teachers, unless they go and become unqualified teachers. But we are facing, several years down the line, a change in the workforce in terms of who are the people who are going to become teachers. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, very briefly, in the White Paper of 2010, Gove made a resolution that he would split the link between universities and teacher education. And that has actually happened at an astounding rate in the way that many of his policies sort of happen overnight before we've had a chance to realise. And this is despite Ofsted reporting that the very best way to educate beginning teachers is in a partnership between schools and teachers in schools and teachers, lecturers in universities. So that evidence has just been completely ignored. And we should have realised, really, because in July, in the Daily Mail and the Telegraph note, a DFE spokesperson said, "For too long, left-wing training colleges have imbued teachers with useless theories that don't work and actively damage children's education." So, the writing was on the wall. And there's a new policy now called School Direct, which means that initial teacher education is coming out of the responsibility of universities, going into schools. Schools can decide how much of a relationship they want with universities. So it could be a normal PGCE type route, or it could be they're just there to sign or stamp the certificate or the qualification at the end. Or it could be anywhere in between. I was at a national UCU meeting this week, where we passed a motion calling for action on that issue, because with the cuts in finance that means for university departments and job losses for lecturers, we're facing a very difficult situation. One of the things we said in that motion was that we should join together with teacher unions, because it's a workload issue for teachers as well. You can imagine, on top of everything else that you're struggling to do, you may well then find that you're responsible for educating beginning teachers. So we feel that's a really important issue. And it's not that, of course, students don't have lots of things to learn from people who are doing the job and struggling to find innovative and creative ways of giving children what they deserve. But it's more about, I think, having the opportunity to step back, come out of the classroom, reflect, be critical. For instance, when a student's going to have a chance to be critical of the primary curriculum, they can't really do that while they're constantly on the job. They need time to step back, talk to other people, think and develop a model of teaching and learning so that the next strategy that's thrown at them, they don't sort of catch and run with. So that we're developing a workforce of teachers that will not accept things like the primary curriculum or the early years framework without being critical about it. And of course, this new model of ITE is softening up the situation for privatisation, because it will only be a matter of time before academy chains step in and take over, and they can then become bodies in themselves that train teachers. So what we'll see is that it's the academy's view of teaching and learning that replace the view of local authorities as they become more and more involved in the situation. So that's my rant about ITE, but I do think there are huge issues down the line if we don't act now together to try and do something about that. So that was in the face of no evidence, or the evidence that was in place. And of course, some people have talked about the Cambridge Review today. There was a lot of evidence in there that showed that the test-driven agendas that we're working with now impoverish children's lives. They don't transform them. And for instance, with synthetic phonics, again, something we've talked about a lot today. If anybody knows the study that this whole programme is based on in Clackmannanshire, it was wholly flawed. There are huge flaws in it, in the outcomes, because actually what it found, surprise, surprise, was that children can read individual words very well, but actually their comprehension skills are very poor. The other thing is that actually it's methodologically flawed, that the research has never been published in a peer-reviewed journal because it has methodological flaws. So again, the evidence is there that synthetic phonics isn't what it's cracked up to be, and yet it's been at the basis of a national programme which is enforced, policed even. And just a word about what happens in university ITE departments. I don't know if you're aware that ITE departments are scored on a traffic light system on how well they teach synthetic phonics. So red, amber, green. Schools that, education departments that have a red attachment are subject to dawn raids. Did you know that? That the Ofsted inspectors drive into the car park, phone up and say, we're in the car park, we're coming now to watch tutors teach synthetic phonics. So, you know, we're under many of the same pressures as well. The other thing that I want to flag up is the enormous amount of research and evidence there is about the strengths and the needs of children with English as an additional language. Where does that feature in the primary curriculum? Actually, where it features is under special educational needs. And yet we have fought for years to make sure that those two groups of children are kept apart. We were talking today, earlier in the workshop on the primary curriculum, about the MFL consultation, the fact that there are European languages, Mandarin, Latin or ancient Greek that children can follow. That's all very well, but where is there any mention of the fact that children who are already bilingual, what about their linguistic skills? They're not mentioned at all. So I just wanted to come back to the Cambridge Review again, because I think there is a lot of evidence of what the vision for primary education should be, and it's very much based on evidence. Just have to read this. 1,052 submissions, 237 national meetings, 13 contributing authors, all experts in their field. And of course, it was produced at the time of New Labour. Ed Balls was the Secretary of State for Education. Remember what he did with it? He ignored it completely. And I think there's one really good, I think it's a great, I know that, you know, there are some things to criticise, but I think there's evidence there about what primary education could look like. And there's a great quote from a parent which says a lot about the perceived purpose of education being much more than the accumulation of knowledge. And this is the quote. She says, "I do not relish being looked after in my older years by a generation, all of whom had level 5 in their SATs, 5-star GCSEs, but who will not be nice to me or each other, and who will not value or seek to invest in relationships which hold communities and ultimately society in place." I think that says a lot. So, what to do? Keep asking big questions. What is primary education for? What are alternative ways of assessing learning? What do we mean by an enabling curriculum? And sharing what we know. Keep having meetings like this that question policy, restating what we know to be good practice from our experience, from our talking together, from our training. And you know, where is subject knowledge if it's not put together with knowledge of individual children, knowledge of families and the context of the school? And you know, deep at the heart of teaching, we all know, is strong relationships with children. Where's that? Last year I went with colleagues from Goldsmiths several times to Tent City University, where we talked about our vision of education. And what was really surprising for us was that in the audience were a lot of young teachers who'd come straight from school because there was a forum to talk about alternatives and to talk about education. I really think the need is there to do that, because I think people are crying out because they know what they're being asked to do doesn't work for kids, and it's not what they deserve. I know that many teachers and schools have kept up the struggle to make sure that innovation and creativity are there at the heart of what they do, because that's how they know that children learn best. And I think one of the key outcomes of the creative partnerships in schools was the transfer of new values and skills into everyday practice. I've been part of a literacy and creativity project this is its 3rd year, in primary schools in East London. And it's based on supporting children's writing, but through things like story making, role play, talk, developing their confidence, and the outcomes have been outstanding. But what is really interesting is that in almost every school there were 1 or 2 children, this is in year 2, with so-called underachieving children, I like to call them less experienced, who didn't speak. These children didn't normally speak in class, and yet within 1 or 2 sessions they started to talk, because they were given sort of permission to take time. There were no right or wrong answers. The class teachers were not under the pressure that they normally are, because they'd been given space for this project. And the children knew themselves that this is what worked for them. So we know that those creative approaches work for children, and they work for us as well. So I think the more we shout out about that, the more that we work together to share that practice, talk to parents, they'll know what works for their children, talk to governors, you know, keep shouting loud, it seems to me. And we know that performativity affects us all. A narrow assessment-driven curriculum, targets, measurable outcomes, league tables, create fearful teachers and fearful lecturers. In universities we have the National Student Survey, which is used as a stick to beat us with. Again, it's public. Of course we must take account of what students think about courses, but that's a very crude measure, of a crude instrument, and yet it's used in very formal ways. So, finally, my message is keep up the opposition, join together, all our education unions should join together to resist what's going on, and to articulate what we know, because together we can make a difference.